Jonathan Gray sat alone in the boardroom on the 89th floor. Outside the wide window, gray clouds loomed over the skyline, casting a silver hue across his aging hands, lined with wrinkles like tree roots. He wasn't the kind of man who sighed often, but this morning he had done it for the 4th time in this painfully expensive room. Every passing minute felt like a slap, reminding him why he hadn't slept in 2 months. Everything he had built was rotting from the inside out. Jonathan founded the Gray Table, the largest restaurant chain in America, a name everyone knew, everyone visited, everyone praised for its food. But the latest reports chilled him. Record high turnover, plummeting internal ratings, anonymous complaints from branches pouring into headquarters, even employee threats of lawsuits over exploitation. It all hit him straight to the gut, mainly because he believed his company had always been built on humanity. Strangely, the senior executives all gave him the same response. The system is fine. These younger workers are just lazy and entitled. He couldn't accept that. Not when he had started this company by scrubbing dishes, mopping floors, and sleeping in the freezer during those early days. So, at 58, Jonathan Gray made a decision no billionaire had ever dared: to go undercover as a low-level employee, to live like an ordinary worker and see for himself the truth the reports were trying to bury. No one on the board knew. Only one trusted assistant helped him with the disguise, forged documents, and chose 3 random locations in 3 cities. The first was a suburban branch in Chicago, where employee turnover had spiked the highest that quarter. Jonathan wore an old jacket, a knit cap, shaved clean, and thick glasses. Under the alias John, he applied for a part-time dishwasher job. No one recognized him. That alone eased the guilt of the deception. The manager, a man not yet 30, spoke curtly and barely made eye contact during the interview. "Ever washed dishes before?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. "You know how to mop a floor?" "Yes." "No days off. 3 times late, you're out. We don't care why." The manager tossed him a wrinkled uniform shirt. "Start tonight, 6 o'clock. 1 minute late, don't bother showing up." Jonathan walked out of the restaurant with the dark red shirt in his hands. He looked down at those hands that had once shaken the presidents, that had signed 9-figure deals, soon to be holding a toilet brush. Part of him found it absurd. Another part knew it was necessary. That evening, Jonathan returned. The place was packed, and employees were frantic. No one acknowledged the new guy. He found the restroom himself and began cleaning. The smell of bleach, the vacuum whirring, and co-workers yelling reminded him of his 20s. But this time was different. No thanks, no help. Instead, a teenage worker glanced at him and said, "Hurry up. I don't want customers complaining about a dirty bathroom." Jonathan said nothing. He kept his head down and kept scrubbing. 3 days later, he started getting to know the team. Ellie, 22, works 3 shifts daily to pay for her mom's hospital bills. An older man was laid off during COVID and is now bussing tables 8 hours a day. A senior-year computer science student, working part-time because his father had disowned him. Different lives, different wounds. One common thread: they were exhausted, overworked, and convinced that no one at the top was listening. For the first time in years, Jonathan couldn't sleep, not from stress, but because of the stories circling in his mind. And if you've ever worked a job where you felt like a machine, unseen, unvalued, you'd understand how Jonathan felt that night. If you've ever seen a coworker break down after a shift but still smile for customers, maybe you should leave a comment under this video. We want to hear your real story, because sometimes your voice can change what money never could. On day 15, he transferred to a second location in Texas. a branch that ironically won an award for outstanding customer service. Yet here, Jonathan saw something that haunted him. A young female employee collapsed in the kitchen. No one called an ambulance. The manager said, "She'll be fine. Let her sit down for a bit, then get back to work." Jonathan stood there, dish towel in hand, heart frozen. No one saw the rage in his eyes. No one realized they had just shown the CEO of the entire company one of the most inhumane moments ever allowed within his system. Jonathan said nothing during the rest of that shift. He just kept working, quietly, but in his mind a loop of images played over and over. The woman collapsing in the kitchen, the manager's cold voice, the clatter of dishes like knives cutting into his conscience. He had once received hundreds of reports saying, "Operations are smooth, employee satisfaction at 84%. But now, just 2 weeks among them, he saw every crack destroying what he once called the dream of a lifetime. That night, he sat in a $48 a night motel room. Flickering fluorescent lights, peeling walls, a faucet dripping like a slow confession. He pulled out his phone and reopened the latest internal report in that still loneliness. Everything looked perfect. He read it like a sweet-tasting lie. And suddenly, he laughed. A dry, bitter laugh with no trace of joy. In the next 3 weeks, Jonathan moved to the third and final location, a restaurant in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Atlanta. He'd been here before, 5 years ago for its grand opening, smiling for photos with the management team. But this time, he arrived as a walk-in job seeker. No one remembered him. And that made him observe even more closely, feel every breath more deeply. There were no shouting managers like in Chicago, no blatant indifference like in Texas. But there was something worse. Silence. Employees didn't talk much. They moved like machines. No laughter, no sighs. Only the fryer's hiss, the slicing of meat, the receipt printer ticking orders like a metronome of exhaustion. Jonathan felt like he was in a place without people, shells moving on instinct. One morning, he arrived for the 5 a.m. shift. Inside the walk-in storage room, he found a young man sitting on the floor, leaning against a shelf, his head buried in his knees. Jonathan approached, just a gentle hand on the shoulder. The boy jolted upright, eyes bloodshot, hollow, and dry. "I'm fine. I just couldn't sleep," he muttered. But his hands were trembling, and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold air. "Why don't you take a day off?" Jonathan asked softly. The boy just shrugged. "If I skip today, I can't pay this month's electricity." Jonathan had no response. He'd read countless articles about poverty and labor pressure. But he had never sat beside it at 5 a.m., in a cold storage room, hearing it spoken aloud with real breath, eyes no filter, no formatting. After that shift, Jonathan stood silently behind the restaurant. The sun was just rising. A group of employees on break stared at their phones and smoked cigarettes. A young woman pulled a cold lunchbox from a plastic bag and ate while her legs still trembled. And in that moment, something inside him collapsed. A kind of awareness you can't undo. He had lived in the world of money and power for so long that he'd forgotten. Some people live their entire lives in a world with no options. And his company, his system, was part of what kept them there. Day 30. Jonathan returned to headquarters. Not in a suit, not straight to the CEO's office. He walked in wearing his old dishwasher uniform, grease-stained shoes, and that same knit cap from day one. The security team froze as they realized who he was. Whispers flew like lightning. 1 hour later, every senior executive sat in the main conference room, eyes wide, faces tense. Jonathan entered. No microphone. He placed his phone on the table and pressed play. First, a video of the woman collapsing in the kitchen. Then, a clip of a young man being shouted at. Then, the student sleeps in the freezer room. No one spoke. "This," Jonathan said quietly, his voice steady but cold, "is the company you're running. And this is what you reported as a stable." One manager stood, stammering excuses, blaming employees, the market, old protocols. Jonathan raised a hand. No more excuses. What he needed was change. "I started this company to build a place where people could grow, where they were respected, not a machine that grinds down their health and dignity." He ordered a complete restructuring of HR systems, the removal of 2 layers of middle management, the creation of an independent employee listening unit, a 15% raise to base wages, and a mandatory program. Every manager must spend at least 1 whole week working frontline shifts each quarter. The initial silence cracked with a few long, relieved exhales from longtime staff. But Jonathan didn't smile. He didn't want applause. He just wanted this to be real, a true restart. No promises, no stage lights. And if you're still reading this far, maybe you, too, have felt the injustice of a workplace. Maybe you've been a victim of it. If you have a story you believe deserves to be heard, leave a comment below this video. We're reading. And someone out there may need your story to wake up like Jonathan did. After that historic meeting, Jonathan didn't return to the CEO's office as usual. Instead, he went down to the Human Resources Department's 3rd floor. There, he did something no CEO at the gray table had ever done before. He asked to meet with every office worker, every logistics team, and every nameless assistant seated in rows like paper boxes. No schedule, no press release. He simply knocked on doors and walked in, introducing himself in a warm, quiet voice. "I'm Jonathan. I'd like to sit with you for 10 minutes, just to listen." At first, people were scared. Scared of being fired, scared of being tested, scared it was all just a publicity stunt. But by the end of the week, a new story was spreading through headquarters. Jonathan Gray actually came to hear us out. Some cried, some shared injustices they had kept quiet about, because they believed that's just how the company works. One intern who had quit 2 years earlier mailed a handwritten letter. "If I had felt respected back then like people are now, maybe I would have stayed. Maybe things would have been different." And then it spilled beyond the company. The story of Jonathan spending 30 days as a frontline worker leaked to the public. It started as an anonymous blog post on an HR forum. I worked beside him and didn't even know he was the CEO. The post went viral overnight. Readers were shocked, moved, skeptical, but they couldn't look away. Social media exploded. The hashtag #RealCEO trended on TikTok, YouTube Shorts, and Reels. Clips of Jonathan scrubbing floors were remixed, reenacted, and debated. Some were funny, some deeply emotional, others critical. But they all circled back to one undeniable truth. He dared to go to the bottom. Soon, other CEOs were being challenged. Other companies were compared. Job interviews started shifting from salary questions to, "Has your boss ever worked a shift with you?" A movement began. 1 week down. A call for business leaders to spend 1 week a quarter working with their employees. And at the center of it all, Jonathan Gray became a new symbol. Not perfect, but brave. A journalist who had once harshly criticized the Gray Table wrote a long piece titled, "The Man Who Made Me Lose Faith in Corporate America. Made Me Cry." It went viral, too. Jonathan was invited to speak on national television. He declined. "I don't need to be on TV," he told his assistant. "I need to be back in the dish pit, so I never forget what woke me up." From that point on, Jonathan quietly left the office every last Friday of the month at 5 p.m., not to his mansion, not to the golf course. He drove an old car to a random location, the gray table. No notice, no blazer. Just him and the same apron he'd worn the month before. Employees who recognized him would freeze up. He'd just smile. "I'm here to remember who I serve." Somewhere in the flood of viral content about him, there's one silent video, no captions, no dialogue. Just a tired older woman in the kitchen, wincing from back pain. Jonathan steps up, takes her tray, places a hand gently on her shoulder, and walks her outside for a break. 17 seconds. That clip got nearly 12 million views in 4 days. In the comments, thousands of stories about parents, night shifts, and the first time someone's boss ever asked, "Are you okay?" If you've read this far, and if you've ever had a boss who made you lose faith in your job, in people, or yourself, maybe now you understand why we're telling this story. The comment section under this video isn't for engagement metrics. It's because someday your CEO might read it. Or maybe someone just starting a business will understand. Never let your chair sit higher than your employee's eye level. Jonathan never became a national hero. He didn't publish an inspirational book, didn't go on a TED Talk tour. He just kept living differently. In this way, he had learned from 30 days of washing dishes. He even told the media team, no documentaries. "I'm not the main character," he said. "They are. I'm here to listen." Today, on his desk sits a low-quality printed photo that is unframed. It's him mopping the floor beside Ellie, the line cook, smiling after cracking a joke. Jonathan is smiling too, a small smile, real. Tired, but alive. Nothing changed forever. Some managers resigned in protest. Some shareholders sold their stakes, scared of rising labor costs. Some headlines questioned his motives. Is this just a long-term PR play? Jonathan never replied. No interviews, no rebuttals. He let the silence of action speak for itself. In that silence, the most critical things quietly began to grow. Winter came slowly in the south, but the cold inside a person's heart could arrive any time. Jonathan Gray exited the basement elevator at 6:20 a.m., holding a paper cup of coffee and a double-sided folder. He had just completed an internal proposal titled the Ground Listening Initiative, a new program requiring every regional manager to work in employee spaces 1 day a week. Not to supervise, just to be present. He walked down the long hallway to the garage without turning on the lights. The soft squeak of his rubber soles blended with the wind whistle through the vents. The whole floor was empty. And at that moment he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Not on stage, but backstage. 3 months had passed since his 30-day return. The system was changing, slowly, incrementally. But changing culture wasn't like changing a battery. It was like rewiring a heartbeat. Slow, precise, unforgiving of even a single mistake. Some managers rose to the occasion. Some tried their best. Others resisted or sabotaged. But one thing gave Jonathan strength, something seemingly small, the way employees looked at him. They no longer looked away. They looked directly at him, not out of fear, but to see if he was still really there. One afternoon, he sat with a few new hires in the staff cafeteria. No one spoke much. Then a young woman asked, "Aren't you afraid people will hate you for doing all this?" Jonathan paused and met her eyes. "I am," he said, "but I'd be more afraid if no one hated me, because that would mean I no longer mattered." They laughed, not politely, but with the kind of ease that comes from feeling like you're in the presence of someone honest. One day, an email came from overseas. The manager of a gray table location in the Philippines wrote to thank him. The 1 week down policy, he said, had saved a team on the verge of collapse. "I don't know who came up with this program," he wrote, "but if it was you, thank you for being the kind of CEO we never dared to hope for." Jonathan replied with a single line, "I didn't come up with it. I just listened to the right people." Slowly, the things he once obsessed over, growth numbers, market strategies, brand metrics, became byproducts, not end goals. Because once he had stood in a dish pit, once he'd eaten cold leftovers beside an exhausted cook, he finally understood. Every company, brand, and symbol means nothing if the people underneath it aren't allowed to live like humans. But justice doesn't always side with what's right. By week 20, Jonathan received an internal warning from the board. Quarterly revenue had dipped by 4.2%. Personnel costs had surged. The company's largest investor began pulling out funds. Some suggested he slow down the reforms, mitigate brand risk, or, at the very least, take a vacation. Jonathan said nothing. He flipped to the final page of the report and marked a red line through the margin. Restructure by trust, not by tempo. 3 days later, he held a closed-door meeting. In the room, himself, the finance team, HR reps, and a whiteboard. He walked up and wrote 4 capital letters. Intangible costs. Everyone measures revenue, costs, ROI, but who measures wounds? Who calculates the cost of an employee quitting from burnout? Who sees the damage when someone stays silent instead of reporting a critical system error? He put the marker down. The room was quiet. "I see it." That sentence had no data, but it outweighed every chart. And just like that, the seeds he planted began to bear fruit. 1 month later, resignation requests dropped by 38%. Internal satisfaction scores rose 22%. Videos of employees filming their managers cleaning floors, sharing lunch, or working late began to go viral. No more polished PR. Authenticity became the best marketing. Jonathan's story was added to a lecture at a top business school, but he didn't know. At that moment, he was in a small location in Nevada, cleaning out a walk-in freezer with a newly hired disabled employee. When someone asked him, "Why do you still go out there?" He smiled. "Because my company has no ground floor, only the bottom of people's hearts." Rumors began to spread. Jonathan Gray was preparing to step down. Some major financial newspapers ran headlines like, "Is America's most emotional CEO still cold enough to lead?" But what they didn't understand was this. Jonathan had never led with emotion. He led by looking reality in the face. For nearly 3 decades, that reality had been filtered through charts, spreadsheets, and the distance between the ground floor and the top office. A journalist once emailed, asking to interview him about his emotional journey from billionaire to floor cleaner. Jonathan didn't reply, but he printed the email and pinned it to his office wall, not as a reminder of what he'd done, but to ask himself, why has something as normal as listening to employees become so rare it's newsworthy? That question followed him. To every meeting, every small diner he visited, every internal email he read each morning. Then, like a chain reaction, letters began arriving from employees. No complaints, stories. A cleaning staff member wrote that her husband had a stroke, but she didn't dare take time off, afraid of being replaced. Now, after seeing Jonathan show up at her location, her manager checks in daily. "How's your family doing today?" A teenage waiter admitted he once thought the boss lived in the clouds. Now, that same boss was carrying trays and asking him, "What are you majoring in?" But not everyone supported him. A group of investors launched the Restore Shareholder Value movement, demanding restructuring HR policies toward performance first, emotions later. They cited modern business principles, optimization models, and profit margins dropped due to increased benefit spending. Jonathan listened to them for nearly 2 hours. No interruptions, no resistance. At the end, he simply said, "You're right, but I didn't build this company to be right. I built it to be human, and I won't trade people for principles." The room fell silent, like the sky before a storm. But Jonathan knew. Storms only hit when a tree stands tall. A few weeks later, the company received a surprising letter. An international labor rights organization had nominated the Gray Table for Best Workplace Culture Renewal of the Year. No one at the company had applied. An anonymous employee submitted the story and a 45-second video of Jonathan scrubbing the floor. The person filming joked, "Why are you mopping, boss?" And Jonathan, without looking up, replied, "So I can listen with my hands." That one sentence was featured in a global forum. No background music, no corporate logo. But thousands of comments poured in from workers who had long believed that dreaming of a better workplace was a fantasy. Jonathan still declined the invitation. Instead, he wrote one sentence in response. "I don't need awards. I need to keep remembering that silence is the easiest thing to fall into when you're at the top." One afternoon, Jonathan was invited as a special guest during a menu redesign meeting. Not to approve anything, just to give feedback on one item, the $4.95 staff meal. He chuckled. After years as CEO, this was the first time anyone had asked his opinion on the tomato soup he'd quietly eaten dozens of times during his 30-day return. "I think it's not bad," he said, "but maybe a bit salty. Probably from the tears of the employee who cooked it that day." The room froze. Then one person laughed. Then everyone did. Not because it was funny, but because, for the first time, they felt like they were talking to a CEO, as a real human being. And if you, reading this far, have a memory of an old boss, a kind word that stuck with you, or a harsh one that never left, maybe share it in the comments below, not to complain, but to remind us all, words matter. Presence matters. And how we see each other on our most tired days can change lives. Just like Jonathan's was changed that one morning in the freezer, when a young man said, "If I take the day off, I won't be able to pay the electric bill this month." On a quiet Saturday evening, Jonathan Gray left headquarters without telling anyone. In his hand, a thin folder containing a report from a newly opened branch in the suburbs of Seattle. Nothing unusual. Average revenue, enough staff, no complaints, no standout praise. A stable location. That word people love to use for places that don't cause trouble. But Jonathan didn't like that word. In 30 years of being a businessman, he'd learned one thing. Stability is often the front porch of stagnation, and stagnation eats away at trust faster than failure ever could. He rented an old car and drove through the night. By the time he arrived, it was nearly 10 p.m. The store lights were still on. Inside, only 3 employees remained cleaning up. The manager was outside smoking. Jonathan walked in, wearing a faded windbreaker. One young boy wiping a table looked up, stunned, and stammered, "Aren't you Jonathan Gray?" Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Tonight, I'm not the CEO. I just want to wipe a few tables." The air changed instantly. The manager tossed his cigarette and rushed in, panicked. But Jonathan cut him off. He asked for a cleaning cloth and started scrubbing tables. Just that. No cameras, no speeches. They didn't say much, but the way they looked at each other changed. Not the look of the boss is checking in, but someone's trying to understand our life. Near midnight, they sat in the corner booth, eating leftover bread from the kitchen. A girl named May, a senior design student, shared that she worked evenings here to pay off her tuition. She said it evenly, with no bitterness, but her eyes carried a storm that hadn't yet poured. "Have you ever hated your job?" she asked. Jonathan stared into his cup of water, thought for a moment, then replied, "Yes, but not because of the work, because of how I used to see the people who worked with me." May didn't say anything, but she nodded, like she'd been waiting years for someone to say exactly that. That night, Jonathan stayed at a small motel near the store. The room was tiny, the bed creaky, the paint peeling off the walls. But he slept well, the first deep, dreamless sleep in months, free of that recurring nightmare of sitting alone on the 89th floor in front of a blank white screen. The next morning, before sunrise, he left quietly, leaving behind a handwritten note on the counter. "Don't let anyone tell you your job is temporary. There's nothing temporary about work you show up to with your whole self. JG." No photos were taken. No posts went viral. But May kept the note in her wallet. And a year later, when she opened her design studio, the first name she printed on the front glass was "Not Temporary." Back at headquarters, the quiet transformation continued. HR reported a 46% rise in job applications compared to the previous year. But more importantly, people were coming back. Former employees who had quit out of exhaustion or disillusionment were now reapplying. Not for the salary, but because they'd heard the company had changed. And strangely enough, those who had once left became the most passionate cultural leaders of the new era. Jonathan didn't blog about it. He didn't give speeches. He didn't throw celebration events. He just sat in his office, reading every letter from employees. Some handwritten, some are barely legible, some just a single sentence. "Thank you for being the kind of CEO a real person would be." Then, one day, he received an anonymous email. No name, just a short paragraph. "You don't know me, but I was behind you when you mopped the Chicago floor. I hated you then. Thought you were just some slow older man making my job harder. But when I found out who you were, I cried, because I realized I had become the kind of person I hated most, and you didn't hate me back." Nobody knows what Jonathan did after reading it. But the next morning, when he walked into headquarters, every employee noticed something different. He wore the same dark red crew shirt he had thrown at his face during his undercover shift. And this time, he wore it like a medal that no one could take away. Throughout that week, Jonathan didn't attend board meetings, review contracts, or answer emails. Instead, he walked floor by floor through the company's headquarters, a new habit the staff jokingly called CEO on a stroll. But to Jonathan, it wasn't a stroll, it was a survey of the human spirit. On the 12th floor, he sat with the UX design team, listening as they shared a new interface that would let employees swap shifts without needing manager approval. Because not everyone's brave enough to ask for time off, one young designer said. Jonathan simply nodded. On the 7th floor, he stood silently in the cafeteria for 5 full minutes, watching every face, every smile, not to assess, but to make sure that what he was trying to grow wasn't mutating into a slogan. And as he was leaving the building, a young woman came running after him, hesitant. "Sir, may I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead," he said. "Why are you still the CEO?" Jonathan smiled, not the media-trained smile, but one soft as a still evening breeze. "Because I believe, if the last one out is the one at the top, maybe, just maybe, this place can still be saved." She said nothing more, and he stepped into the elevator, disappearing behind its quiet silver doors. One day, in a tech department meeting, someone proposed using AI to evaluate employee performance. The pitch was clean, the charts were sharp, the phrase objectifying emotion was tossed around. Jonathan listened, as he always did, and when they reached the end, he asked, "Has an AI ever asked you, 'Hey, are you okay today?'" Silence. A young engineer muttered, "No." Jonathan leaned in. "Then don't teach machines to do what people haven't learned to do well yet." That line wasn't in any economics textbook, but it stuck with everyone who heard it, and from that day, the company paused integrating AI into human-facing processes. Not because technology was evil, but because humanity wasn't yet good enough to hand over emotional authority to machines. Time passed. 1 year after Jonathan left the air-conditioned leather chair on the top floor to wash dishes, the company held a modest anniversary gathering. No fireworks, no big stage, just a quiet meetup with whoever was working that day. Jonathan didn't speak. He didn't cut ribbons. He didn't stand on a podium. He sat with a group of night shift workers, shared food with them, and listened to stories that never made it into an email. Someone asked, "Aren't you scared things will go back to the way they were?" Jonathan didn't respond right away. He stared at his bowl of soup, then said quietly, "Yes. But I also know this. The only thing that stops the past from returning is when the new people refuse to give up. And maybe that's why he never retired. Not for money, not for power, but because he feared what had just started to be called right might die young in the following quarterly report. He kept visiting stores, no longer in disguise. Everyone knew who he was now. But strangely, the more they knew he was CEO, the more comfortable they were around him. Not because of the title, but because his reputation had been written in dirty aprons and stained shoes, not on LinkedIn profiles. One evening, sitting outside a store in San Diego, the ocean breeze brushing across his face, a new employee stepped out to smoke. He spotted Jonathan, hesitated, then asked, "Did you really wash dishes for a whole month?" Jonathan looked out at the sea and smiled. "Not just a month. I've been carrying it in my head ever since." And that's the part no news story ever captured. No article, no viral video. Jonathan didn't just take a round trip and come back. He carried that journey into the way he saw the world, not to build a better strategy, but to become a better human.